So you've noticed a slow leak in one of your sprinkler heads, even when the system is off and you can't figure out why. 9 times out of 10, the problem is with the valve. But before you rush right out and buy a new valve and spend time, money, and effort, I'm gonna show you guys how to diagnose the problem and a quick and simple fix to try first. So the very first thing you may have noticed is a wet or soggy spot in your lawn or planter area, even when the system is off. Many times the area that it's occurring in is the lowest point in the system. This condition will be typical of a leaky valve. So now we're gonna have to go to the valves. This valve manifold controls both planter and lawn area. Planters are all drip, so they will have a pressure reducing filter. The ones for the lawn won't. Now the first thing to diagnose this problem is just listen. Try to hear if there's any leaking water sound. And sure enough, we found our culprit. Now that we've listened carefully and we think we know which valve it is, we can easily open the anti-siphon vent cap. And sure enough, we can see water slowly flowing over the top into the system, thus creating our soggy point at our low sprinkler head. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that this valve is the problem. But instead of replacing the whole valve, I'm gonna try this trick first because it's much quicker and easier. Now, it's important to take a second to understand how these kinds of valves work. These are anti-siphon valves, and that just means they help prevent water from backflowing into your system, which could potentially contaminate drinking water. And these valves need to sit above ground, above the highest outlet or sprinkler head in your system. Now, the anatomy of these valves are fairly simple. The flow of water travels into the backside of the valve, which contains the diaphragm and all the components to turn the valve on and off. And that water sits under pressure. And when the valve turns on, the water flows out through the anti-siphon vent and down into the system, powering your sprinkler heads. So to do our quick fix, we are going to need to remove the cover of the back part of the valve called the bonnet. And inside the bonnet is the diaphragm that we need to access. Now, before we get into the valve, we're going to have to turn the water off to the valves first. So let's pop that lid open and turn the water off. So we're going to get our drill and we are going to unscrew that bonnet. And this setup is pretty much the same whether you're using Hunter or Rainbird or any other brand of professional anti-siphon valves. Carefully set the bonnet aside, and the very first thing we see here is the diaphragm. So carefully remove the diaphragm up from the body of the valve. Now inspect the diaphragm carefully on both sides. Sure enough, we see that big piece of debris sitting right there. And I notice another piece, and I'm gonna take that one off as well. There's actually tons of debris that goes through our main line constantly and can get stuck in the very sensitive diaphragm of these valves. Now let's put it all back together. Note that the diaphragm goes back in a very specific way. Make sure to line up those points on the valve body. Give it just a little bit of pressure all the way around to make sure it's sitting snug in place. Once you have the diaphragm in, now it's time to put the bonnet back on. And again, make sure you're lining it up properly. If the bonnet doesn't go back exactly in place, you'll have water spraying everywhere from the valve when you try to turn the water back on. Now be very careful when you're tightening the screws. Make sure not to over tighten, but also be sure that they're snug in place. If I'm using a drill, I like to set my clutch a little bit lower so I don't strip the screws or the body. And once that's all set in place, I'm gonna go back to my manual shutoff valve and I'm going to slowly open it. And if there's a hose nearby, it's beneficial to keep that open to help reduce pressure and water hammer. Water is back on, and now let's manually test our valve. Some valves will come with a handle that slips right over the solenoid, and that's what we have here. And oftentimes just a quarter or a half turn will do it. And we have liftoff, sprinklers are looking good. There's no leaks in the valve, and we did it. And just to verify, I'm gonna check that low sprinkler head again after a while to make sure that it is not leaking any more water. Problem is solved, and we didn't have to replace the valve. And that just about wraps us up for the easy valve repair. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, you guys. Hopefully you learned something new. Hit that like, subscribe, and bell notification so you know when a new video comes out. I will see you guys on the next one, and as always, happy planting.